Builders, welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 64. It's for Friday, and we go live each and every week at Bitcoin Hard Talk, where we have the hardest talk about the hardest form of money, and we take a journey around the world to catch up with everything that happened this week in Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics as we transition to a world increasingly more dominated by Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. My name is Simon Dixon, if we haven't met already, and I'd like to share the next hour and or a couple of hours. And buckle up, enjoy the ride. We're going to make sure that you are up to date with everything that has happened this week, so you are 100% ahead of the curve. So if you are new to the show, I've spent the last 2 decades, now 24 years, of my life dedicating myself to the mission of understanding Bitcoin investing and money. Obviously, Bitcoin came halfway through, but I believe that Bitcoin was a continuation of the monetary reform work that has been executed by previous people over the centuries and, in fact, over the millennia. So today we're going to jump in and we're going to be covering a few things. So it was an epic week again this week in terms of progress. Buckle up. I hope you enjoyed the ride up to 93,000. We had a little bit of a breather, but today we're going to be covering what it means that there are now currently 18 states in America that are actually suing the SEC over the fact that they don't have effective Bitcoin and crypto regulation and the overreach of the SEC. And now the states are suing the SEC as Gary Gensler gave his hint at an exit speech after being a conduit for the deep state and the Federal Reserve and handing over our industry to BlackRock and those that want to try and adjust to the fact that the banks tried to beat us and they couldn't. So they had to join us. And so they use the old tactics of the Federal Reserve, pump and dumping interest rates in order to manipulate the economy and execute a mission to support their shareholders. And the shareholders are, of course, the banks, and the regulators are just captured in order to not protect consumers, but execute the mission of the deep state and allow for the financial institutions that are on the right side of the Federal Reserve to try and take over the industry. But fortunately, Satoshi Nakamoto had foresight. Satoshi Nakamoto had vision. And Satoshi Nakamoto designed Bitcoin when no central bank, no government, no large financial institution, no developer, no individual that is mining significant amounts of Bitcoin, no node operator, no individual, no venture capitalist, no user could take over Bitcoin because it created the largest distributed supercomputer in the world. So we're going to be going through what that regulation means, because the regulators couldn't regulate Bitcoin and they can regulate the companies. And so why are the states now suing the SEC for acting on the best interest of the Federal Reserve that occupies America as the tension gets deeper and deeper, as more and more people discover that the Federal Reserve is simply a mission for communism, to bankrupt the US government and to take the world with it through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other organizations, as Bitcoin creates a resistance and an exit and a boycott for those that want to escape the debt slavery of the Federal Reserve. So what else did we have? We had the first state in America that actually released its Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Strategy and released the bill in order to protect itself from the Federal Reserve. And we're going to be going through a bunch of the history on why this is such a historical moment. For those that don't watch Bitcoin Hard Talk, they would have passed by and said, this is just a normal announcement. But today we're going to dive deep in the Bitcoin section into the history that helps you understand the significance of this moment in terms of its fight, America's fight against the banksters, against the Brits, against the Bank of England, against the deep state, until the Federal Reserve won. And now the states get to fight back. and they get to use Bitcoin as strategic reserves as well as treasury. So we will be going through the significance of this event. And we're going to go deep into history, as we always do, for those that don't just want to read the headline, but understand why this is a historical moment as we share this journey together. And then finally, that's going to be covered in the macro section. So we would have done Bitcoin and macro. And then finally, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what happened that's significant in the geopolitical side, and make sure that we are ahead of the curve in understanding the key warhawks, the NeoCons that Trump has brought into his administration in order to fight and reward the fact that the deep state allowed him to play president. And while he's playing president, he has a choice. He can either fight against the Fed, the CIA, and the deep state, or he can become the CIA, the deep state. It may cost him his life. It's already had 2 attempts at his life, and we shall find out. But there is deep concern around some of the people that have been brought in on the geopolitical side that will determine whether the proof of weapons network that requires war in order to roll over a debt-based Ponzi scheme called fiat currency, whether it gets to continue. So 100 days, it is up 90%, while other people will be saying, people were saying on this show, should I be buying it? It's too late. I missed the boat. Why don't I buy a meme coin? Why don't I buy an alternative to Bitcoin? Because there is only one Bitcoin. And so overall, though, our industry, Bitcoin and all the others, 60% of it is Bitcoin, but the entire sector passed $3 trillion of market capitalization this week. Not only that, but if you look at the Google searches for the word Bitcoin, it had a massive spike and a massive surge as we passed 90,000, 91,000, 92,000, 93,000. And now we had a bit of a correction back to give it a breathing space on our journey to the next milestone. They told me when Bitcoin hit $1, it's too late. I missed the boat, and many people sold. Same for $10, same for $100, same for $1,000, same for $10,000, and it will be the same once it hits $100,000, as I'm sure it will. I can't give you financial advice, but you can bet your bottom dollar that I am a Bitcoin thinker, and a Bitcoin thinker means that we take our fiat currency that we earn, we spend less than we earn, we cover our expenses, and the rest of it is saved in Bitcoin. And then we have strategies for optimizing and protecting our wealth and building and protecting our wealth as we grow. And that is the concept of Bitcoin thinking that I've been trying to get everyone is. When the price crashes, you're happy because you get more Bitcoin for your fiat currency. When the price goes up, your net worth in dollars goes up, and you get to have more impact in the world and protect yourself from the inflation of the Federal Reserve. And hopefully you bring many more people in with you. We are in a mission to get as many people to own Bitcoin in self-custody as possible, because I believe we are witnessing one of the largest wealth transfers that we have seen in recent history. And I'll be going through, here's the beauty. The Federal Reserve, the central banks used to play the game, but you can now decentralize and you can play the game and you can front run. It is still early in that journey. And I hope in this section, you'll appreciate more as well. And so we hit yesterday, I believe it was, or the day before, a record of $93,000. That is the new all-time high for Bitcoin. At the same time, BlackRock, who is trying to get as many people to own their Bitcoin with them, so that if, just in case, the Federal Reserve can persuade the government after their next pump and dump cycle, if it goes into a Great Depression as they did in the 30s, then they can try and get the government, as they did in 1933, to confiscate all of your Bitcoin in exchange for the shitcoin called the US dollar, some Federal Reserve notes or digital, or even a central bank digital currency. They can swap it out, they can nationalize MicroStrategy, and then they have the Bitcoin strategic reserves that they did with gold before they stole it from American people. And then that was meant to be owned by Treasury, but the Federal Reserve used it as collateral for wartime debt and stole all of America's Bitcoin and made sure that it went to the European banksters, as we will be describing today when we do the historical section of why the state strategic reserves are such an important moment in history. So the Bitcoin ETF this week, BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF, the largest Bitcoin ETF in the world, is now larger than the gold ETF. Think about that. The gold ETF. More people hold Bitcoin with BlackRock in an ETF than they hold gold with BlackRock in an ETF. That is our next milestone, and our milestone has been reached. Hopefully it's not you. Hopefully you will be owning it in self-custody. And for those of you that are not ready to do that, it's okay. Eventually, I'll make sure that we're doing our Bitcoin Wealth Builder program next year, where I guide people every 4-year cycle, through how to make sure that you're all set up for this as well. And you're not falling for the same tricks that other people may be falling for. So anyway, BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF is now $40 billion in assets. And that happened in just 211 days. $40 billion of assets in just 211 days. That is the most successful ETF launch in history. And it was Bitcoin that did that. And some people still believe that they should be listening to Peter Schiff, as Peter Schiff will be the last person in the world, and probably the Federal Reserve, that will end up buying Bitcoin as the world flips Peter Schiff, and the world flips the Federal Reserve, and the global South and all around them have the opportunity to be involved in changing our financial system forever. So it was this week, approximately 11 years ago, I posted it on my X account, a video by Peter Schiff, where he was arguing that Bitcoin was not a store of value and nobody should be saving in Bitcoin. And he still says it to this day. And on that day, as that video was posted, Bitcoin hit $300. He was also recommending that everybody should be investing in his fund. And what was his funds doing? He was saying that the US financial system is about to implode. Now, he is right on the long term, but the execution and the advice is wrong, because he is saying bet against the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the most important central bank that controls the entire ecosystem, as it did when it took over the Bank of England's assets and many other things that I'll be discussing in the history side as well. And obviously the US dollar has been the strongest fiat currency, but anyone that was betting on those currencies got wrecked. Anybody that betted in the non-US stock market, because they don't understand that the Federal Reserve set up the International Monetary Fund to suck in the world's global capital, to destroy the economy and create a debt-based Ponzi scheme that would destroy anybody that borrowed from the International Monetary Fund, as they print their own currency to pay off that dollar debt in what is known as a milkshake theory, where it sucks up all the world's capital into the US market until eventually the wealthy and the Federal Reserve owns pretty much everything for the benefit of the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, the banks. Well, gold did reach a new all-time high. It's been correcting this week relative to Bitcoin, and that's because the Fed announced. We'll cover more on that with those announcements in the macro section. But gold did reach all its all-time highs after it confiscated it all from the US people. So the advice was right in a sense. But when you price gold against Bitcoin, when you take his advice and you price it against US dollars and the Fed, it was the worst performing asset out there, because it tanked 20,000% relative to Bitcoin. So thank you very much, Peter Schiff. You got the predictions of the financial crisis right. You built your reputation around being right, but you got the diagnosis wrong and you wrecked all the investors. And if any of them ended up depositing their funds at Peter Schiff's bank, the government seized all of those funds. A reminder, the government seized all of those funds, and he is suing the regulators while all of those people are locked out of their money in the gold-backed bank account. A reminder of why self-custody is important, because everybody that invested with Peter Schiff after the worst performance, after missing out on Bitcoin, after getting the analysis right, but the solution wrong, ended up having their government the government seized all of those assets. And to this day, he still continues to mock those Bitcoiners. We never forget. And so at the same time, if you were a Bank to the Future investor, you received thousands of Bitcoin dividends, the highest performing investments in history. We launched the Bitcoin bond in 2014 and 2013. In fact, I went on TV at the same time as that interview, telling people that there is untapped value in Bitcoin at $300, and has now gone up 20,000% since then. And a little bit of a self-serving announcement. After all these regulatory changes, the Bank to the Future team have been busy at work, and now they secured their European Union license to offer Bitcoin financial services with its registration in Poland. And by the end of this year, I'm sure we're going to be making an announcement, because we are at the final stage of a 1-year process of getting the approval for the ability to offer these financial services in the UK as well. We will be making announcements. If you go over to banktothefuture.com and you click the announcements tab, then you can see the new EU regulations that we achieved as well. Right, now let's take a little bit of a tangent in terms of some of the announcements that were made on the political side, how it relates to Bitcoin, and then we're going to be going deep down into a bit of the history in the Bitcoin section today before we finish off with the macro section and geopolitical section. So there was a stroke of genius that actually came from, shout out to Wayne Vaughan, who I often go on spaces with, and Bitcoin OG. And we were on a space and we were discussing the concept. And he came up with this name of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. And it was a department that's now headed up by, Elon Musk as well, in order to create more efficiency for the US government. Now, people are getting this wrong. They think that you can then use that to pay down the debt. Now, if you're a Bitcoin Hard Talk viewer, you know that there is no paying down the debt. The Federal Reserve designed the system where if you pay down the debt, you get punished with a depression. And then the Federal Reserve takes on all the assets and gets the government deeper into debt, rolls over all of the banks, makes them bankrupt, puts them all into JP Morgan until eventually they get that central bank digital currency, communism on a blockchain, where all of the assets head over to the central bank. And the government needs a strategic reserve asset to fight against the Fed when it tries to implement its CBDC. Well, anyway, because they called it Doge, there is a shitcoin that was launched as a joke that Elon Musk loves. And to be fair, it has stood the test of time as an investment. And it got global TV, the Department of Government Efficiency, which was then coincided with the fact that Dogecoin, DOGE, had the same initiatives, and it went up like 150% in the week. Got global exposure thanks to the work of the crypto community. And then Elon Musk took that on. And then there was a press release around the Department of Government Efficiency, which will forever be connected to the joke coin, the meme coin, Dogecoin as well, cementing itself in history. Congratulations to anybody that have been involved in that trade. I'm not here giving any advice around Doge. I just don't mess around with the gambling. I focus on the long-term investing and changing the financial system and getting as many people to join me, replacing their income with earned income as artificial intelligence takes over, preserving their freedom through self-custody as the Fed introduces its central bank digital currency network, and making sure that you benefit from Bitcoin to protect yourself from the money printing of the proof of weapons network as well. But anyway, the Department of Government Efficiency, it was hilarious. We do like a bit of a joke in our sector. But remember, the efficiency cannot be used in order to pay down the national debt, because you need to have banking and monetary reform at the same time, which is what I've dedicated my lifetime work. And now people are debating these issues, because my forecast in 2025 is that the Trump administration will end up having to fight the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is doing their classic pump and dump cycle in order to attack Donald Trump and the Trump administration in case it does not execute the mission of the deep state, if it ever tries to implement an end the Fed bill, then the Federal Reserve has got the entire US economy, and it can pump up those rates, it can crash the banking system, and it can blame Donald Trump for the fall of the US empire if it chooses, because that is what America signed up for in 1913, and that is where America is, where it is got to build tools to fight against the Fed as it's become more and more centralized through the excessive government debt as well. But here's the beautiful thing. If the Federal Reserve wants to, not the Federal Reserve, sorry, if the US government wants to protect itself from the Fed, it can take all of those efficiency improvements and combine it with Cynthia Lummis's Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Asset Bill. So rather than paying down the government debt and crashing the economy into a depression, it can take those efficiency improvement, it can use that in order to buy Bitcoin, and it can get the whole country in a mission to get the government more efficient in order to purchase more Bitcoin. And it can do all sorts of things like El Salvador's doing, like restructure Social Security and all sorts of things. And even Bitcoin, even Peter Schiff was joking about it. And I put some comments on my X. Make sure you're following me on X to stay up to date for all the real-time updates. But anyway, you can take those efficiencies and you can invest it in a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset. And when the Fed tries to bribe America, you can then have an end the Fed bill where you can reduce those reserves over time, and you can replace banking and fractional reserve banking with stable coins and transition very peacefully if you want to do it in an evolutionary way. Because if the Fed gets its way, it will take the world to World War III for the deep state, for the benefit of the military industrial complex, so that it can shift an empire and write the new world order, which I believe involves artificial intelligence, Israel, and a very, very brazen mission from Mossad that has co-opted CIA, as we'll cover more in the geopolitical section. Anyway, I digress. And so that Bitcoin can slowly reach a position where it can slowly reach parity with the national debt as it is for El Salvador, if this strategy is executed well, as the world reaches FOMO and needs to beat and front run the US in building their Bitcoin strategic reserve asset. You can use stable coins, you can do all sorts of things, you can increase the bank reserves over time, and you can end that Fed and end fractional reserve banking, and America can become constitutional America and avoid becoming communism on a blockchain through a central bank digital currency based upon sound money. And even if it wants to, if the population grows, if it can reverse this fact that the birth rates are going down and they're having to supplement the demographic issues by having immigration, if they can reverse those trends either through making sure the birth rate increases or they have supplemented through immigration, then it can have a peaceful transition and issue more stable coins as the population grows. Anyway, I don't want to go deep into banking reform. If you are not a member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, head over to simondixon.com, press that yellow button, and you'll see all of the different services you can get for free. One of them is a Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Another is where you can get this on my podcast, recently launched, and you can have it on the move, download it to your phone and everything for free. But if you get a member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, you can get a digital copy of my book, which I wrote in 2011. It was the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin, and it covered how to transition and how to protect yourself when governments go bust. Anyway, Bitcoin fixes the Fed if there is the political desire to do it, but there is a very dark history that protects the Fed. And we're going to be going through that today as well, so that we can understand and look out for what is actually coming. Now, the time to build a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset is when the dollar is strengthening. And that is happening right now because the Fed is preparing for a pump and dump cycle. It is reducing rates. I'll cover more in the macro section why it's doing that as inflation increases. And it can suck up all of those dollars and it can build the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset, and all of the countries can do it at the same time. Rather than paying down those IMF loans, it can, rather than printing the currency and allocating it just to America, it can also, those countries can build their Bitcoin strategic reserve assets as well. But there is a very important thing, and this is going to take us into the history section as we cover all of this week in Bitcoin. The vast majority today is going to be on Bitcoin. We're going to have a smaller macro section and geopolitical section as well. But there was an announcement. I was on an X Space with Dennis Porter. If you hadn't seen it, go to my blog, simondixon.com, or go to my YouTube channel. You can see my interview with Dennis Porter in Bitcoin Hard Talk interviews when we were talking about the announcement of the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset. Well, I joined him on an X Space this week where Pennsylvania State, it was announcing that has introduced its bill and it is going into for approval in order to invest up to 10% of Pennsylvania's assets into Bitcoin strategic reserves. Now, that creates the statewide FOMO that is needed in order to have the states protect themselves in case it's not done at the Treasury level or the federal level. So this creates statewide FOMO, and that gives the ability for the states in the future, if they choose, to be able to restructure their banking system and go independent, become 52 countries if it chooses. If the Federal Reserve tries to launch that central bank digital currency and turn America into a communist country. So these are all the important strategic reserves at the state level and the Treasury level in order to make sure the Fed does not turn America into communism. I also wanted to look out as well. So one of the people that Trump is going to be introducing into the Trump administration. Let me make sure I get the name right. A name called the guy called Scott Bessent. Sorry, he is Trump's preferred candidate for Treasury Secretary. Now, it may have been announced. I'm not sure if it's been announced by now. But if everything is basically, he came out on TV, and I shared the clips on my X account, and he hints that he said, let me quote, everything is on the table with Bitcoin. And that was after he was questioned about the idea of a Treasury level Bitcoin strategic reserve for the US government. And so I think that this is totally on the table, and now is the time to do it while the dollar is strengthening, not when the Federal Reserve executes its evil strategy. So the time to get this through is when it's positive for the dollar rather than negative for the dollar in case the Fed tries to change the empire and drive us into World War III. And so at the same time, the states are starting to unify around the Bitcoin vision. So at the state level, they can push for some of them were introducing legislation to allow people to pay for their Bitcoin tax. That can lead to very important reforms where if you're paying your tax in Bitcoin, then you may, if you have a rise, if you have a gain, that may mean you create a taxable event just in selling it. So in paying that, they may introduce exemptions, which essentially takes Bitcoin and makes it more like a currency, like it is in El Salvador, because you don't incur taxes by spending it. And so by allowing this, we get more and more movements towards Bitcoin as legal tender at the state level. Then you can also have protections for self-custody. At the same time, they can build their strategic reserves, and we can have statewide FOMO and exert pressure at the Treasury level. But the interesting thing, what was getting in the way, as I covered in the intro, it was the deep state. The Federal Reserve was using its relationship with the SEC and its regulator, and now 18 states are suing the SEC for going ahead and sidestepping the states and introducing, the SEC level regulations. And they claimed that this is an unconstitutional move, and they would like to take back that power away from the SEC. And they listed the stooge of the Fed, Gary Gensler, whose only meeting with anyone in our industry was meeting SBF from FTX. And we got some more news on that as well, which I'll cover after the historical section to understand how we actually got here. And so I will watch this with interest, but it is a symbol of either the Biden administration trying to get some points at the end of it and introduced a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset so that he can say that it wasn't Trump that did it, it was the Biden administration that did it, but we won't forget the truth. Or this is a symbolism of the states preparing for a pro-crypto environment, pro-self-custody environment, pro-Bitcoin environment, and state-level strategic reserves under the Trump administration. So what was the lawsuit anyway talking about? So it was talking about how the SEC uses the Howey test. I'm not going to go deep into that. Essentially, it's a test around whether a crypto asset is a security or not, based upon whether it is the efforts of others, under the management control of others, people investing for profit. And then we have this Howey test in order to determine whether cryptos are securities. And it is saying that that is not a way of determining whether crypto is an investment contract, and the state wants to regulate those cryptos and not have it done by the SEC. This is to help the exchanges that were being sued by the SEC while they were trying to destroy the reputations of companies that I invested in the early days in private before they went public, like Coinbase and Kraken and Circle and various others. And basically help the exchanges so that they can get back on. And there was a wave of announcement that we covered last week of people relisting these different types of cryptos, and then that's going back to the state level. So this is all very positive stuff as well. And what I want to do now, again, I'm going to take a detour, and I'd like you to join me on this journey before I go into the macro section. I would like, once and for all, everyone to understand exactly how we got to where we are having the biggest fight for our freedoms to prevent central bank digital currencies, and how we can use Bitcoin as a tool. And I want you to understand, and this is what I've always done at Bitcoin Hard Talk, I don't want you to just understand the headline. I want you to know how we got here, so that when people say to you, it's just a conspiracy theory, that you can fight back with the historical precedent, because it is very unreasonable for people to think that these central banks are good institutions acting in the interest of the American people or the world. And so in order to understand that, let's understand how we got here. It was a fight between my people, the Brits, and the colonizers that were taken over by the Bank of England and the deep state of the Bank of England in order to bankrupt the UK government and use that power in order to take over America at the same time. So how did America operate during the colony when the British Empire existed and it was going through its colonialism? Well, during the US colonial period, essentially American colonies, they decided to create their own paper money. And it was created, guess where? At the state level. So what had happened back then is the states decided that it wanted to fight back against the British Empire. First, it was Massachusetts, and that was in 1691. And this was after, the Bank of England was created in 1694. And that was trying to introduce, the privately controlled version of the Great British Pound and use it in order to destroy other people's currencies. So in 1691, Massachusetts decided to do it. Then guess who followed? You guessed it. The one that is creating the strategic reserve and introduced the bill this week, it was the state of Pennsylvania. Then New York came next. Then Delaware came next. And then Maryland came after that as well. So the states wanted to fight the Bank of England as it was introduced. The currency that they created was called colonial scripts, or it was bills of credit as well. But the important point is that the states were able to take the profits from creating money and make sure it wasn't introduced and handed over to the usurers and the central banks that would take all the profits from creating money, and then they wouldn't get to invest it in the infrastructure within the state. And so this is how you had the buoyant state level growth at the time. This was essentially what allowed America to free itself from the British banks. And so the British banks and the Bank of England really didn't like this. Why? Because the states at that time had zero inflation. They had really low taxes because the profits from creating the money was invested in the infrastructure, and it meant that it didn't need to tax the American people. And the economy prospered without the central banks. And the Bank of England hated that. Well, that was the worst thing that could ever happen. And so in 1763, Benjamin Franklin basically went and visited London. And because the economy was prospering so much, and it went and visited London, and it saw the extreme poverty that existed as a result of the Bank of England taking over the Great British Pound Proof of Weapons network and driving UK into war after war after war, so that it could then profit from all of those wars in the Proof of Weapons network and bankrupt the US government and take all of that tax and get income tax in 1694 so that the British people could pay the interest on all the debt so it could fight the wars so that it could profit and fund both sides of the war. That is why the Bank of England was set up. And it drove England into vile poverty. The slums were disgusting in England. And Thomas Jefferson, he went and visited London and said, what is going on here? What is the secret? And it turned out that the secret that Thomas Jefferson understood was the fact that the state's ability to create their own currency. And so by issuing debt-free currency and debt-free money for the benefit of the state, it was in a prosperous environment. So what did the Bank of England do in order to fight back in this, because the states were prospering so much in the state banking system? Well, in 1764, the Bank of England came in and it introduced a currency bill. And that currency bill was forbidding the states from creating their colonial, their colonial currencies on their colonial scripts, and they stopped it from issuing their own currencies. So they removed legal tender status so that it could not be used in order to pay the taxes, both private debt and public debts. It said if you want to pay private debts and public debts, you need to use the Great British Pound Proof of Weapons network issued by the private bank, the Bank of England. And you can no longer pay your debts using the state-backed currencies. They are no longer legal tenders. And what it did is it requested that these state banks basically issue bonds, and that the indebtedness of the government, because it took back the power to create money, it could only pay the interest from these bonds using Bank of England notes. And so it tried to corner America. And then what did it do? Once it had control over America through the Bank of England GBP Proof of Weapons network, well, the economy collapsed across the states immediately because half of the nation became unemployed, because they could no longer invest in its own infrastructure, and it was servicing the debt of the GBP Proof of Weapons network. And then what did they do? Well, the Bank of England and the colonizers, they introduced the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act in 1765, it was to charge tax on the American people and make sure that they could only pay it in the GBP Proof of Weapons Ponzi scheme, so that it could use that tax, because the UK government was bankrupt by the Bank of England and it needed to fund wars. It needed to fund wars against France that was introducing their own debt-free monetary system. And so in 1775, the US decided that it would issue its own constitutional dollar. It was called the Continental Dollar, and it was based upon the US Constitution principles and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it would use it in order to fight back against the Bank of England. And so what did the Bank of England do as America started to create its own continental dollar? Well, the Bank of England created and printed fake continental notes, and it created its own counterfeit continental dollars so that it could hyperinflate the economy in America and reverse all of the progress it was making by having its own debt-free currency. And so the abolition of the colonial currencies was the primary cause of the revolution. And the revolution led to American independence. And in 1776, America expelled the usurers and the Bank of England and decided to declare itself independent. And Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers would then fight in order to make sure that the European bankers would never take over America again. And it would have multiple fights. And unfortunately, corrupt Alexander Hamilton allowed it to introduce a central bank. And so while the Independence Day got rid of the Brits and you got independence, there was a fight, and Alexander Hamilton handed over to the European bankers again the right to create the dollar. And the way that it did it is it said that 20% of it will be owned by the US government, the bank, the first central bank. And the other 80% will be owned by foreign interest. And approximately in 1791, Congress in America gave the Bank of the Bank of United States, that was now covertly controlling America and the dollar. And it became known as the first bank, and it got a 20-year charter and a monopoly on creating the US dollar for foreign interest in a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and took away the profits from creating the profits from creating money debt-free from those states and from America. And so America became occupied once again. And what did it do? In 1792, it flooded the market with cheap loans and crashed the entire US economy again so that it could purchase all of those cheap debts using the fact that it controlled the dollar, and it cornered the bond market. And it used the crash in order to purchase cheap debt, and so that it had the US government under its control once again. And what did it do with that power? Well, it requested the government to repay its loan using the currency that was issued by the foreign occupied Central Bank of the United States. And in order, because the price crashed so much, it used the 20% stake that it owned in the central bank and used it to repay those bonds to the first central bank. And now 100% of the central bank was completely under foreign control. So you see this fight. This is when people actually used to fight. And they didn't just stay because they were indoctrinated through economics, when the Federal Reserve funded much of the US universities and colleges in order to create minions to work for its system and accept that its system is how money should be created. So anyway, the bank became 100% privately owned. It used the pump and dump and the fact that it controlled the dollar in order to make sure that it was 100% controlled by foreign interest. Of that 100%, about 75% was foreigners, and those foreigners were deeply connected to those that created the Bank of England and took over and did this exact strategy to take over through the bond market, the US government, and entered into the Rothschilds family and all of the banks that they have created that sits underneath it, that to this day are still shareholders in the Federal Reserve as well. Anyway, after the disaster that came from this, after 20 years, they did not renew the bank charter, and it was basically because it was privately owned, and there was a big debate within Congress, and because it was privately owned and because it was not constitutional, they managed to get through, and they managed to not renew the charter as well. But the Rothschilds, Mayor Rothschild, that was essentially the foreign ownership of the 75% through many different shell companies, what did he do? He came over to America and say, how dare you take back control of the dollar a second time? How dare you expel us from America? And he said to the American Congress and the American president that if you do not renew the bank charter, and this expired in about 1811, then we will fight and we will get you into war. And we will drive the British government that we control through the Bank of England to declare war against America. And you will be in war if you don't do this. The only problem is that Rothschild, while he controlled the government through the bond market, UK was broke. It didn't have any money. And so the prime minister at the time in the UK, let me make sure I get this right, was Percival. And Percival, because he was broke already, fighting both sides of the, fighting the British side of the war, while the Bank of England funded both sides through the Rothschild family network, they refused to fight the war. Basically, in order to get revenge and to get the next central bank, the US had to get both Britain and US to fight that war. But Percival refused. And so what happened? They assassinated him. And so the Rothschild family had deep connections to the assassin, and they simply assassinated him because he said no in order to fight war against America. And sure enough, in 1811 and 1814, he got the UK to declare war against America, bankrupt the UK, bankrupt America, and got his revenge so that he could then get the second central bank of America chartered and take over the dollar again. And who was the person that fought this time? It was President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson said, we will not allow the Rothschild family interest and the Bank of England to take over America again, and basically shut down the bank and basically got through the bank and then shut down the bank and refused to renew the charter. And this was approximately 1835 when there was a failed assassination attempt against Andrew Jackson. That was because the second bank, and he said he will not renew it. And basically the Rothschild didn't get their renewal. And if you look back, Andrew Jackson was a famous reformer, monetary reformer. And what did he do? As soon as the assassination attempt didn't work, Andrew Jackson decided to take down the second bank by crashing it. And how did he do that? He withdrew all of the Treasury funds and all of the funds that belonged to Treasury from the central bank. And he used those funds and repaid the national debt in its entirety. Too prohibitive. Basically, the central bank was replaced by another state banking system. And after the bank got shut down, Andrew Jackson on his dying bed said, I killed the bank. And America got back to constitutional America again. And the Rothschild family implemented its third strategy. And so for approximately 77 years, the people like Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War decided to issue their own currency. It was called the greenback. And it was issued by Abraham Lincoln, and that served as the monetary policy alongside the state banking system. And also it created a mint, and through that mint, it could use its vast gold reserves in order to mint gold and silver coins. That became its strategic reserves, essentially. So gold and silver built back its strategic reserves, started to circulate as coins and cash, and it would use debt-free money in order to expel and shut down the central bank and remove the foreign interest and invest in infrastructure and invest in the rebuild. Debt-free. And Andrew Jackson managed to get it all debt-free. Of course, what happened when Abraham Lincoln introduced the greenback? Well, in 1865, the Rothschild family assassinated Abraham Lincoln and basically use this in order to essentially push the wars and corner the bond market once again. And it would then used the US Civil War debt in order to take over America. But this time it used, because Abraham Lincoln was fighting against the introduction of a third central bank, this time it decided to corner the gold market and make all of those silver coins worthless, because gold has a larger stock to flow ratio. So if you look at the measurements, basically Bitcoin is the scarcest. It has the lowest stock to flow ratio, which makes it the rarest. Then you have gold, which is more rare, and silver is more plentiful. And so the Rothschild decided to corner the gold market through issuing wartime debts and make sure that they assassinated Abraham Lincoln and get the American government deep into debt again. And so basically, those currencies, or the currencies that were issued, the Rothschild family would corner those debts. It would get all of those government bonds, and it would introduce legislation through force, through assassination, whereby those bonds could be converted, and they cornered the bond market in America, and those treasuries, they converted into gold. And so in 1869, there was a bill that was introduced called the Public Credit Act. And the Public Credit Act meant that those treasuries, those bonds, the government debt, could be paid at face value, but based upon gold. And so all of that gold went through by converting those the government debt into gold. And the Bank of England was essentially able to corner the gold market and create all sorts of pump and dumps through the gold standard. And this is when we entered into the era of free banking, and we entered into the era of the Rothschild family using gold manipulation, just like they use the Federal Reserve, in order to create crashes, in order to create credit crisis, and in order to create panics. And they would do it periodically because it failed. Abraham Lincoln wouldn't let it open, the third central bank. And so it needed the third central bank. And this time it was going to use a different strategy. It wanted to pump and dump the American market using gold as the strategic reserve asset that it controlled, because it was held in custody, rather than allowing people to own their gold in self-custody. And anybody that owned their own gold, it needed a strategy to try and steal the gold off the American people. And so what did it do? It wanted to justify the Federal Reserve Act. So firstly, it made it and confused it into, rather than calling it a central bank that was private, that was known as private ownership, it fooled the people by calling it federal this term. And then it made it out like it was there to prevent all of the panics and crashes by having a strategic reserve that it could use to be lender of last resort. And essentially, it wanted the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 to be implemented so it could bankrupt the American government and use the American government to go deep into debt to fund all of its wars again. And so what did it do with the gold cornering? Well, I don't want to go too deep, but we had the first crash in 1873. We had the next one in 1884, then in 1891, then in 1893, then in 1897, then in 1903, and most famously, through the Rothschild frontman JP Morgan, the 1907 panic, where it essentially underwrote the whole banking system so it could consolidate 10,000 banks into, there was 20,000 banks at the time, consolidate them all into 10,000 banks. And JP Morgan could use that in order to design the Federal Reserve System, which was created as the creature from Jekyll Island with the Warburg family. They were all intermeddled through marriages, the Morgan family, the Rockefeller family, and Jacob Schiff as well. That was the WarHawk that would make sure all these wars would happen and execute these missions. And basically, would get the Federal Reserve Act through. There was a president that wanted to take on this gold manipulation at the time. That was President Garfield, and the Rothschild had him assassinated because he wanted to introduce an act that would prevent the manipulation of gold happening within America as well. And so in 1913, he managed to get it. An interesting story as well. This was around the time that the Titanic went down. This is just speculation. There's no real proof for this. But the major opponents of the Federal Reserve Act were all on the Titanic when it sunk. And they introduced it on Christmas Eve, or the 2 days before Christmas. And they called the bill something completely different. It talked about things that were nothing to do with the Federal Reserve Act, and it hid it in a slight clause. And there was only 34 people voting at the time, and they got the Federal Reserve Act through. And what did they need in order to take control of America at the time? And to this day, this is still the same institution, still the same system that was designed at the Creature from Jekyll Island by the Rothschild family and the Rothschild family conduits and members of the banking system, and the Zionists that also created many of the Zionist legislation, and even Zionists from Israel, or Israel wasn't created at the time, but they had a plan to take over parts of Israel from Palestine, what they were going to call Israel, and started drafting legislation in the Federal Reserve Act as well. But what did they need? They needed the same tools that they used with the Bank of England to bankrupt the UK government. They needed income tax. So in the same year, America got income tax to pay the debt on the war debt. And then they needed a war because all of that debt was paid off previously. So they needed the deeper and deeper debt so they could make sure that they can control the US government for their means. So they pushed the world into World War I. They created Israel by transferring wealth from the British at the time, and the British were occupying Palestine. They got them into fighting the Ottoman Empire, and they used this in order to get America into World War II as well, because they now controlled the Federal Reserve, and they managed to get the Brits in order to do the Balfour Declaration, because Winston Churchill was in deep, deep debt to the Zionists and the usurers, and they executed the New World Order and massive, massive change. What did they implement? Well, by having the Bank of England and the ability to control the UK government, and by having the Federal Reserve and the ability to control the US government, they wanted to corner all of the gold so that it would enter into America. And so they created some ideologies. One of them was the Marxist ideology called communism. And communism was introduced by taking Russia, that had a debt-free monetary system, zero inflation, the highest level of gold reserves, and it stole all of Russia's gold by funding the Bolshevik Revolution, which was funded by Jacob Schiff, the creator of the Federal Reserve, the Rothschild families, and a JP Morgan loan, which were intermarried into the Rothschild families, and created the Soviet Union and replaced the beautiful economy of Russia, stole all of its gold, bankrupted the government through the failed ideology called communism. And so it had that part, the communism side, through the Soviet Union, cornered. It also had a way of stealing all of the gold of Germany. And so it destroyed the German economy by introducing a similar central banking system. This created the rampant hyperinflation that we know during this interwide period. And the German government fought back against it, arrested the Rothschilds. The economy was destroyed, massive degeneracy. You had those, and it created essentially Nazism, which Nazism stands for National Socialism. What is National Socialism? National Socialism was debt-free money in order to fund its own infrastructure, and it managed to escape from the debt, and it used that to expand its national empire, and then it led to the forces that led to World War II. There was all of the immigration from there was the Jewish people negotiated with Hitler that the first people could go and then become immigrants in Israel as well. And they could bring their wealth with them. That was a very controversial negotiation happened between the Zionists and the British government and the Nazi regime as well. But this hyperinflationary environment led to the mass theft of all the gold because it could come with them through these negotiations. And then it led to the violence that led to World War II because there was a resistance movement against it. And then Hitler obviously blamed it on all the Jewish people. And that led to what we now know as the remnants of World War II. What else did it do? Well, it got America into debt slavery. Why? Because it took the Constitution and pretended that America was a capitalist society. It pretended that it was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But it slowly got the Federal Reserve Act in order to fund war and war and war and use the US dollar in order to bankrupt the US government, pay for all the wars. And it would introduce the intelligence agencies like MI6 from Britain. And then that led after World War II to the creation of the CIA. And later that led to the Mossad takeover of the CIA as Israel started to take over more and more of its policy and move away from an American first policy to an Israel first policy by being able to control the money printing of the most powerful world reserve currency in the world, the dollar, use intelligence agencies in order to create CIA covert regimes, and make the American people believe that they had democracy based upon the Constitution, but the Federal Reserve was unconstitutional money. That's why America's so deep into debt. And that's why it's interesting that we get this resistance from the states and the Bitcoin strategic reserve asset as well. What is it that the Federal Reserve did after World War I? Well, it created the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties then led to an 80% correction in the market based upon debt and derivatives. Then it scooped up all the assets. It had all of the gold that it stole from Germany, from Russia, from Britain, put it all in the Federal Reserve. And then it used the Great Depression in order to implement the changes that were needed to steal all of the American people's gold. And so in 1933, the government made gold ownership illegal. That all ended up in Fort Knox. And then that was used as the wartime debt was collateralized against the gold. And that's why when you audit the Treasury, it looks like the government, the US government, has no gold, even though apparently the largest gold reserves are all in Fort Knox. And why we never get an audit of the Federal Reserve, because then it would see the largest theft in human history. And maybe all of that gold would have been transferred to Rothschild & Co. in London and the jurisdiction for the Bank of International Settlements that was used. And maybe it's there as well, but we will never know. After World War II, it created the New World Empire. It created the Bretton Woods system. And it needed the Cold War in order to fund the next wave of war. It had its two ideologies that it funded: the Soviet Union and communism that was used to steal all of Russia's gold. It had the Federal Reserve System, which was slow introduction of socialism and bankruptcy of the US government, which was the capitalist ideology, even though it had no hard money. And it stole all of the hard money by printing Federal Reserve notes and created the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, and 157 different central banks, and created war to any country that would not implement its central banking system and its debt-based Ponzi scheme. Who were some of those that fought against it? Well, Gaddafi in Libya and other types of Middle Eastern countries that stayed because they managed to get away with all the Christian countries. They abolished the usury laws because it was a debt-based Ponzi scheme based upon central banking. And the only countries that were left that stayed to it were the Islamic countries through Islamic finance. And so Israel was used in order to demonize war after war, covert operations, and create a war on terror for any country that wanted to remain on a non-usurious Islamic finance system and have free markets and free trade and hard money rather than implement the Rothschild banking system. And so what did the Federal Reserve do? Well, apparently it had a dual mandate, which was to make sure that it had full employment and a stable currency. Well, it had no stable currency. It created 20 recessions. It devalued the value of the dollar by 99%. Its purchasing power went down 99%. It created $36 trillion of national debt for America. It created $250 trillion in committed liabilities through Ponzi schemes that the financial system and the investment banks and companies like BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard all benefited from by pooling together everybody's money through Social Security and Medicare and ETFs so that they could take all the voting rights of every single stock, and got America into 250 trillion of additional liabilities, also through the interest on that debt and all of the war obligations that it now has to have, because it's now got $1 trillion of obligations that all goes into the stocks of the military industrial complex, which backs the Federal Reserve and the US dollar proof of weapons network Ponzi scheme. And the audit had never happened into the Federal Reserve because America would be appalled if they found out. And this is why Jerome Powell this week said, Trump, I don't care if you're in power. I'm more powerful and you can't fire me. Because he controls the interest rates and he's got the entire economy on the balls. And if Elon Musk wants to implement any efficiency, it needs to be done with a strategic reserve asset to free itself from the Fed in conjunction with the ability of an end the Fed bill so that Trump can either join the deep state and be a conduit of the Fed or fight against it. And we get to determine whether he'll do it because all of those bills are in front of us right now. So who are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve today? Well, it's done through a regional banking system. They try to make it look more decentralized. And then the banks that are members of the FOMC that determine interest rates every month, and those banks get the 6% dividend, and then the rest of the profits go up to Treasury. But all of the profits and money creation is through those private banks that are shareholders of the regional banks, and then that goes up to the Federal Reserve System as well. The shareholders, the largest shareholders, are the Rothschild banks of London and Berlin. So remember the remnants of the Bank of England and the remnants of the German system. And also Lazard brothers of the banks of Paris. So from the Paris Empire and the banks that became the Federal Reserve as well. Israel Moses Bank as well, from creating Israel as a conduit that I believe in the future will be used in order to launch a global central bank digital currency using all the AI and cybersecurity data that Israel is stealing from Wall Street and Silicon Valley as we speak right now, including Elon's platform, where the data from the free speech is going back to Israel through Palantir, which is controlled by Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel is an Israel first policy, because that is what the IDF is using in order to execute genocide as a service in Palestine right now, and is being sold to dictators around the world for the Israeli AI military industrial complex if they can execute the genocide by persuading all of the Jewish people to leave America, leave Britain, and join the IDF and kill Palestinians so that they can beta test all of this and launch their AI central bank digital currency, which we're going to protect ourselves from through Bitcoin. Who else are the shareholders as well? Well, the Water Bank of Hamburg and Amsterdam from the German side and the Amsterdam side. Let me remember as well, there is some American interest. Congratulations, America. You own a little bit of it. You own it through Shearson American Express. But guess what? American Express, part of it's public, but the rest of it is owned by foreign interest and American banks as well. You got some of it as well. You managed to get the Goldman Sachs of New York to be a shareholder as well. And of course, JP Morgan Chase Bank, and JP Morgan was a front man for the Rothschild family through all of the shell companies as well. And as a result, of course, you got bailout after bailout after bailout that was used on the American taxpayers' dollar and the inflation that was created through the Federal Reserve banking system, which culminated in the 2008 global financial crisis, where BlackRock told the Federal Reserve through its Aladdin artificial intelligence, which banks to go and who to give to JP Morgan, and how to consolidate many of those financial systems and get the government to pay the bill and fight more war, which led to more destabilization across the Middle East with Arab Springs in 2011, various other things. But what also happened with the fall of Lehman Brothers as well in the 2008 global financial crisis? Well, I covered it in previous episodes. You'll know that the Bitcoin resistance was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, and we created a way of unwinding the whole thing and freeing ourselves from the grips of the debt-based Ponzi scheme and the European bankers that successfully, through assassination, murder, managed to take away constitutional America and implement its communistic ideology and bankrupt the government towards socialism until they get that one central bank digital currency. If you didn't watch it, feel free, if you want to geek out over the weekend. I created an episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk. I can't remember which number it was. Go over to simondixon.com, head over to the blog, or download the Bitcoin Hard Talk podcast in the Apple Store, or log into the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, all free. And one of the videos recently, I think 2 episodes ago, was 16 years of Bitcoin history. I go through the whole 16 years of history as we created this resistance movement. So why is it important to know this stuff? Let's bring it back to the context of today. The Federal Reserve and the SEC executed their same old pump and dump cycle in order to make sure that the Bitcoin that you can own in self-custody ended up in the coffers of Bank of New York Mellon, custodied through BlackRock, so that they can have the artificial intelligence data, because anyone that owns it through BlackRock, in an extreme circumstance of World War III, the government can say, in order to save America, we need to give you some Federal Reserve central bank digital currency, swap out your Bitcoin, we'll keep the Bitcoin like they kept the gold, and you get a central bank digital currency, opt into the terms and conditions, opt into handing over all of your data on your phone, and you can get your bank balances back in a time when they crash the banks and replace it with a central bank digital currency. In order to do that, they needed, through Gary Gensler at the SEC and Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve, to create a pump and dump and draw NATO into expanding NATO in Ukraine to get Russia to retaliate, push a war-hawking agenda to get China to want to reunify with Taiwan, and make sure that they had an operation like October the 7th so that Israel could get its war that it wanted to regime change Iran so that it could take over the oil that it needs in order to execute this vision, and use the media that it controls, that it used in order to fool people when it got the other central banks, because the Rothschild family controlled all the press. And now the Israeli Zionists control all of the media in America and UK, just as we saw with the riots in Amsterdam, which was a blowback from the violence from the Israeli football hooligans and IDF and Mossad that came over to Amsterdam, in order to make it look like any retaliation against that was a anti-Semitism and self-hating Jews and various other things that they say, in order to justify all the wars and say the whole world's against us. So while we're exerting genocide, please feel sorry for us. The only government and country in the world where they're exerting the most horrific genocide the world has ever seen on camera and say, you need to feel sorry for us, we're the victims. Well, anyway, they did that in order to transfer the crypto over, and that's why I encourage self-custody. But Bitcoin and Satoshi Nakamoto built in a protection from BlackRock. It built in a protection from Bank of New York Mellon, which is that you can own your own money, you can spend your own money, and you don't need to hold it with them in order to exert that. And thankfully, it's not like a stock where you hand over the voting rights. And so BlackRock was used to get the voting rights of everybody's shares, and the proof of work network called Bitcoin. It doesn't matter, because there are no voting rights, because it created a decentralized network. I'm going to cover exactly how to protect yourself. I'm creating a video series right now, as I said. If you're a regular listener, every year after the halving cycle, I invest live and I show everyone how to put their Bitcoin in self-custody. I'm going to be reviewing what I did after the last halving cycle, how the portfolio performed. I also show people what I would do if I had no savings and I was starting over again. Because people always say, hey, Simon, you were involved in Bitcoin since $3. You can't replicate that again. Well, I'm going to show in 2025 and make sure you are a member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Well, I'll make sure that you can get the 2020 video series for free, review that, and then we'll be doing the 2025 one. And I'll be guiding people on how to self-custody and how I do it, exactly how I invest today, and how I would do it if I was starting from scratch as well. But this video now, bring it into current situation. The states can now fight back once again. And America, if it chooses, can be constitutional once again. But you need to understand how. And that is the opportunity that exists today, because we've got freedom of speech for as long as it lasts, because Elon Musk has essentially given all the AI data to Israel, allowing us to speak freely. And for as long as we can, we need to speak as freely as we can. And the Trump administration, because Harris didn't win and take down the platform, hopefully we get it for another 4 years, where we can change the world as we transition to a world of Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. And I need you to share this message. Share this video with everybody you care about. Hit the like button. Put a comment if you're watching the recording. If you're in the live chat, help the algorithm. Google does not want anyone to get this information, because many Zionists control Google and YouTube as well. And they have a censorship strategy that Elon Musk fought against, and they reached that compromise. So the Treasury can now fight back against the Federal Reserve. And I covered it last week in the video on how to end the Fed. I think the video last week I covered Trump won, now end the Fed. And they can do that with a Bitcoin strategic reserve. We can protect ourselves by building our own Bitcoin strategic reserve. So no matter what happens, we don't have to depend upon government. And make sure you watch last week's video to understand the opportunities that exist today. And we're going to cover the final bits of news that happened in Bitcoin, so that we can put all this together and understand it from, what is Trump going to do next and how can we get ahead of it in both the macro section and geopolitical section. Okay, so let's cover the final bit. I hope you enjoyed that history detour. I get very excited about it. If you're as geeky as me, I like people to understand this stuff. If you like it, hit the like button, share it with everyone else. You need to understand what you have got yourself into. Right. So the FBI, in other news, fought against, they did a raid on Polymarket. Remember, we covered that last week. People were betting through crypto assets, non-US people, on whether they could determine who the next prime minister is. And so because some US people were using it through VPNs, they claimed that they knew. And remember what I said, you really don't want to mess with these things. Well, the FBI, the CEO of Polymarket, got his home raided and started seizing his phone so that he could download all of those messages and find out what's going to happen next. He was accused that he was basically allowing US people to bet knowingly, despite the fact that at the federal level, that is illegal. We also had, remember, SEC Gary Gensler basically had meetings with SBF, allowed FTX to scam people by not protecting it. The DOJ was investigating companies like Celsius, which was an Israeli Ponzi scheme that sold billions of dollars of creditors' money. But some of the other people, other than SBF, they're now settling in order to make sure they don't end up in prison. One of the people, the co-founders, or that joined Alameda Research and then joined FTX. Alameda was the hedge fund that stole all of FTX's client money, led to the crash that led to the Operation Choke Point 2.0, where none of the banks could serve any of the companies. And then they handed over the industry to the custody industry like BlackRock. Well, one of them was called Trabuco. And Trabuco settled with the Department of Justice, or was it FTX? Well, he settled for $8.7 million and he settled 2 apartments that he bought with client money in San Francisco. He also settled with his $2.5 million yacht that he bought, which was called Soak My Deck. The gross type of things, pretty hilarious, but that's what it was called. And he basically gave up 17 million of claims were disallowed as part of the settlement. And that is now settled as well. I think he avoided jail time, or maybe there'll be some sentencing coming up. But that's settled as well. At the same time, in the FTX bankruptcy, FTX is now suing Binance founder CZ. We covered that. He only got 4 months prison sentence because he negotiated a US coup of Binance so that the US government could take over access and the data of 250 million accounts, and then started implementing an Israeli first policy, seizing through financial blockades all of the accounts and then leaving it up to the Israeli government to determine whether those funds could be returned or not. But now he is out of prison, the FTX estate is suing CZ for $1.8 billion and suing Binance because client money was used in order to buy back shares that bought out the position from over Binance as well. And so they're going to be coming after that money. And if that money comes back, it will go to creditors. I thought it was going to go to shareholders, but they're doing it via the Bahamas entity, which means that the shareholders like Kevin O'Leary that is stealing client money by taking the upside of Bitcoin. And I covered this in previous broadcasts, so I won't cover it again. And even though he got 15 million to endorse people into FTX, he is trying to get the creditors upside through the shares. In order to avoid that, they sued through the Bahamas entity, and then that created a way of the money not going to shareholders and going to creditors instead. But this may backfire. Why? Because CZ could countersue. Remember, when they came after SBF, they only went after the crimes that SBF committed, but they didn't investigate any of the political corruption. They didn't investigate any of the SEC corruption. They only investigated the China government corruption in order to, a bribe that was sent through to a politician in order to unlock $1 billion of seized bank funds as well. So all of the corruption could come out because CZ or Binance can now countersue. And we know that there was a lot that was covered up in terms of Democrat financing and Ukraine financing, and they were all left out of the investigation. So CZ, Binance, countersue, drain the swamp, show the information that was hidden so that we can really find out what the SEC was up to, what the deep state was up to, and what FTX and the SEC's role was in this whole Ponzi scheme as well. So stay tuned, Democrats. Stay tuned, Ukrainians. And they'll also, there was different lawsuits that came out. There was a flurry of lawsuits because after 2 years, they've got the time in order to, there will be no more lawsuits after these. But there was suing of the not-for-profits as well. This is good. So the FTX estate is now going to be suing the not-for-profits that received all of the political donations. And so this opens up those cases again. And do we see the same thing that happened to Jeffrey Epstein happen to SBF? We shall see. But we shall keep watching the cases. We shall follow the money, and we will get to the root cause of it at the end, unless the deep state makes sure that it is never shown. Because it doesn't want to show what the SEC was up to, what the CIA was up to, what the SEC was up to, and what the Fed is up to. Anyway, we understand all these things as well. Anthony Scaramucci for $67 million as well. So we get to look into that a little bit deeper. Something called Humpy the Whale. They're going to be suing them for $1 billion for market manipulation. We'll find out what that operation was. And at the same time, outside of the FTX case, we had the money that's being returned to Bitfinex victims. Full disclosure, I'm a shareholder. But the 119,000 Bitcoin that was stolen in 2016, covered this many times in previous episodes. The Bitfinex hacker, Ilya Lichtenstein, has now been sentenced to 5 years for money laundering after stealing 119,000 Bitcoin. And the Department of Justice has seized the majority of those, and that will be coming back to shareholders that still have claims on those as well. His wife, Heather Morgan, otherwise known as the Crocodile of Wall Street, if you look at her rap videos, her sentencing will be happening next week, and we'll cover it next week on Bitcoin Hard Talk. At the same time, now that we're getting this new overhaul and Gary Gensler is being sued by the states, and Gary Gensler gave his speech saying he's probably retiring, and the Trump administration said on day one he will be firing Gary Gensler from the SEC. The coins that weren't allowed to be listed, not recommendations from me, suddenly all came back to all the exchanges like Pepe token, Solana, Cardano, XRP. And so we get a shitcoin casino, which was predicted under a more pro-friendly environment where the SEC and the CFTC and the Doge Department of Government Efficiency can determine what efficiency improvement, and we get change. Hopefully we get to stamp out some of the corruption. At the same time, MicroStrategy, which outperformed every single company on the S&P just using Bitcoin, it announced that it's acquired another 27,200 Bitcoin for $2.03 billion at a price of $74,463 per Bitcoin. And now MicroStrategy holds 279,420 Bitcoin that it acquired for an average of $11.9 billion at an average price of $42,692 per Bitcoin. And they are raising $42 billion more to buy at the same price that you get to buy in. And I will be buying in every month because we're just getting started. We're just getting started. In other news outside of America, we had a real focus on America recently. Russian President Putin proposed that it would be creating a global BRICS investment platform that is going to be utilizing digital currencies as the backbone of the system. So that's one of the projects that they're moving forward. My prediction is that Bitcoin will enter into the mix, whether America chooses to do the strategic reserve at the treasury level or at the state level into the BRICS system and the design of the new unit. And remember, we get to look at the other country policies and how they are interacting with Bitcoin. Remember, we covered on Bitcoin Hard Talk, Germany's strategy. Well, after its occupation by the European Central Bank, the European Union and Germany decided to sell all of its Bitcoin at the bottom of the market. And after it sold all of its Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin surged 52%. And in the last, we covered the prices as well. So Germany, remember what happens when you bow down to the European Central Bank. The German government, free yourself from the ECB and buy your Bitcoin strategic reserve asset if you don't get assassinated in the process. Italy came out and it decided, you know, that capped crypto tax? They wanted to double the crypto tax. It decided, hey, we don't want all of our people leaving Italy. And so decided to fight against the European Central Bank, even though it handed over its currency, and allow Italians to protect themselves from the ECB by keeping the additional corporation tax that it was going to increase to 42%. Is now announced that it's keeping it at 28%, and it wants to benefit from Bitcoin rather than having all of its people move. Remember the old Italian economist, Nouriel Rubini? Nice try, Rubino. We know you love the ECB. We know you love the proof of weapons network, and we know that you hate Bitcoin. But Nouriel Rubini, you did not win. Germany, you sold all your reserves. You get to make up for it, protect the American people, and make sure that the Germans get to benefit from it. That's everything in the Bitcoin section. We're only going to do 2 more sections, so I'm going to take a quick water break. And now we're going to go into the macro section. We're going to have shorter sections in macro. And then I'm just going to go through in the geopolitical section, making sure how we can tie all this together based upon some of the Trump picks so that we can understand, is Trump part of the deep state or is he going to fight back against the deep state? Remember our policy. Our policy, when I said how I would vote, I said, Biden and Harris, you committed genocide. You killed people. You are the deep state. You will never be forgiven. You must be voted out. And Trump, you come in because of your Bitcoin strategy, and we will judge you and hold you to account because we gave you all of the tools that exist in order to take on the deep state. And the next administration, we either call him out or we praise him when he does stuff. And so right now, based upon his appointees, which I'll cover in the geopolitical section, it's not looking good. But before we do that, let's cover the macro section. Right. Do me a favor. YouTube hates my videos. It hates the geopolitical section. So I need you to comment. I need you to help the algorithm. I need you to hit the like button. And while you do that, while you do the repost, while you share it with somebody, while you share it out on X, put a comment underneath. Let me know what you'd like to see. I'm going to take a quick water break and then we're going to jump straight back into the macro section. Hit the like button, share on 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's jump into macro. Right, so we had the consumer price index numbers from the Federal Reserve and from the government. And the consumer price index was 2.6%. That means it's up from its last print, which was 2.4% in September. So we had greater inflation, according to their stats, in October than September. Mortgage rates, they're currently around 6.5%. That was as of mid-November, as I was creating the content for this video. And basically, this shows that the inflation problem, which the Federal Reserve said is solved once it gets back to 2%, is not solved. It's gone from 2.4% to 2.6%, and it's been cutting rates. Why is it cutting rates when inflation is going up? Because it is exerting maximum leverage over the Trump administration and showing Trump who's boss, and was engaging in the political interference around the time when Iran and Israel were determining how it will retaliate and whether they want to give the election, the pro-economy, to Biden and Harris or go with it to Trump. And because Trump was doing an Israel first policy and agreed to install many of the Israeli first war from the previous administration, he was a chosen one, as we covered in previous episodes before it was actually decided. So what does this actually mean on the macro side? The market is anticipating that we will have a gradual look at the treasury markets and the longer dated treasury markets. It's forecasting that in December there will be further rate cuts. And then in 2025, even though inflation is on the rise. So this is your classic pump and dump scheme that the Federal Reserve can set up. Basically, the CPI rise is introducing that there is uncertainty because it's meant to be going down based upon it reducing those rates. Also, with the Trump administration, tariffs could increase inflation because tariffs was the tax that used to happen before the central banks introduced income tax. But because it's so much cheaper to manufacture abroad, manufacturing through a protectionist policy will cause higher inflation. So inflation is expected to go up. Rates are expected to go down. That's the exact classic Federal Reserve. I've got the economy by the kahoonies, and you've got $36 trillion of debt, government, and $10 trillion of it exists on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. So what am I expecting based upon all of this? On the macro side, I'm expecting another rate cut in December, probably 1/4 point. And I'm expecting through to 2025 tensions to get greater after day one between the Trump administration and the Federal Reserve if Trump does not hire the deep state people that the Federal Reserve wants in order to execute its Mossad takeover of the CIA and have an Israel first policy. So you are seeing some of those hires happening so that Trump can be the president. Another forecast is that, remember how they teach you in economics textbooks through Keynesian economics and Milton Friedman monetarism that you have to have inflation based upon the Bretton Woods system that the central bankers implemented. They said you should have 2% inflation. Well, now 3% is the new 2% target. That's my forecast, because it's probably going to go up to 3%. It's probably going to lower rates, and tariffs is probably going to create more inflation. And so expect a that type of environment moving into 2025. And so moving into Bitcoin, going above 93,000, what happened? Well, Bitcoin is no longer the 8th largest asset in the world. The 8th largest asset in the world is silver. So Bitcoin flipped silver and replaced and got another market cap above silver. And the next on the list, the 7th largest asset, is all the oil that comes from Saudi Arabia, thanks to America's partnership in extracting it, which leads to the petrodollar, which is the system that Abraham Accords was meant to protect, which is what Israel is doing by sidestepping Iran and making sure that there's never Palestinian freedom, exerting the genocide that America pretends it's not involved in, while it's funding all of the weapons over to there. And it gets it gets Saudi Arabia to buy all of the weapons from the Proof of Weapons network, which makes sure all the dollars that are propping up the demand for the dollar then go back to Saudi Arabia so that it can then have a policy of normalization with Israel. And the Trump administration sent over all those weapons that were used to kill civilians in Yemen through Saudi Arabia, essentially destabilizing the region and making sure that Iran and Saudi Arabia can never normalize like China wants them to. And the deep state gets to create forever wars within the Middle East using this. Well, one of those companies is the 7th largest asset, Saudi Aramco. And we flipped Saudi Aramco and we're round about the same market cap. So now Bitcoin is coming after the oil. I predict that Saudi will be announcing at some stage, or definitely regions like UAE and Qatar, trying to front run America in implementing a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset in case those protection negotiations fall down. And it wants to work with BRICS and China in order to create the yuan petrodollar, allocate some of it to BRICS, or start buying its weapons from America, Russia, China, and Iran, if it wants to normalize and create a global South, which can then have this nice environment, depending on what comes next. At the moment, it is firmly in the side of America, which is why we've got Palestinians being genocided, and why we've got America trying to be forced into a war with Iran so it can implement regime change, so Israel can have an environment and take over that oil and then create its energy into its artificial intelligence to create its central bank digital currency and AI warfare and AI military industrial complex. Anyway, so who's next for Bitcoin? Well, the next are the tech companies. And the tech companies all have very large positions from BlackRock and from the pension systems and all those others and all of the investment banks, which is why they are all may need to transition with a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset. Who's next? Amazon, Google, Microsoft, who is voting on whether they're going to hold Bitcoins within their treasury in the coming, I think in December. Apple and NVIDIA, which is the AI play that is providing the hardware for all of the AI companies. So that takes it all the way to the top of the largest assets. And Bitcoin is now 7th behind those tech companies. And we get to catch up one by one. And if those companies don't want to be flipped by Bitcoin, they can all put a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset. And NVIDIA can even start to work with data centers in order to provide data centers that can mine both AI and Bitcoin. And we can have open source AI to fight against the closed source central bank digital currency AI. And it can be integrated with Bitcoin mining as we transition to the electricity providers. And that's why all these wars are fighting over LNG and natural gas, because that is the commodity of the future that is going to power the hardware of the future, that requires the chips from Taiwan, and that requires the commodities from China, and why China will be involved in normalization. And we need a Palestinian cause so that Saudi Arabia and Iran can move towards peace. Then we have a multipolar world, and then the dollar can expel the deep state and fight back against the Federal Reserve using Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. And just in case the Fed wins, the states can fight back and have a state banking system and a strategic reserve asset in case the Federal Reserve decides to create a pump and dump scheme in order to implement its agenda of a CBDC backed by artificial intelligence and an AI military industrial complex. We need the resistance against it. That's why we need to make sure that you own Bitcoin in self-custody, and everyone knows that they all need to protect themselves. This is not a crypto pump and dump scheme. This is the most interesting time. Everybody needs to secure the reserves, and the companies cannot be flipped by Bitcoin. But what is the top asset, the number one asset? $18 trillion. Bitcoin's about $1.5 trillion right now. The number one asset is gold. And so we are coming after gold because look at the ETF trends. The young people are buying Bitcoin, they're not buying gold. Those that are going to be benefited from the system and are going to be passing on their gold holdings to their young people, they're going to sell their gold and buy Bitcoin. Those that need strategic reserve assets are going to be using Bitcoin in this game theoretical scenario. When central banking gets predatory, we have this global game theory at the state level, the federal level, the BRICS level, the country level. And that's why the central banks are buying gold and everybody else is buying Bitcoin. This is a currency war. The central banks want gold and they want you to consume their fiat currency. We're giving you Bitcoin, which will be the asset of the governments to protect themselves and you to protect yourself. And we can free ourselves from fractional reserve banking through stable coins and free the world from the central banks and expel them once again, as has always been the case in history. And why do you think that they want you to believe, the FBI wants you to believe that it is Iran that has tried to assassinate Trump? Look at the 3 people that were arrested. You'll find that it goes back to Israel and Mossad. Significant evidence once again. And who controls intelligence? Who controls the FBI? Who controls the CIA? The FBI is the CIA at the top. It all happens in secrecy outside of Congress because it's the same people that created the central banking system that control it today. And you think none of this is happening anymore. Look at the world. Wake up, people. Follow the money. Don't follow the words. Don't listen to the people saying it's conspiracy theories. Don't listen to the people saying this is anti-Semitic. Don't listen to the people saying that if Jewish people is anti-war, then they're self-hating Jews. It's a psyop. And that's why they're implementing all the laws right now to make sure that you can't resist against it. You can't boycott the companies that are engaging it. You can't talk about anti-Israel because they're calling it anti-Semitism. Those that own the Congress through APEC are making sure that you lose your freedom of speech. You lose your right to resist. And they want to make you think that it's something that it's not. See through the psyop. Stay ahead of the information curve. I'll keep you updated on Bitcoin Hard Talk as we go through it. Sorry, the geopolitical and the macro section tend to merge. I get a little bit excited. Let's get back to macro. On the oil side, there was a big victory during the COP conference, which is the carbon neutrality, where all of the countries were going to invest in renewable energy. And all of a sudden, what happens during war? Everyone says, screw that. I need to focus on my country, and I'm going to be protecting my country through oil, through natural gas, and the whole climate change that was implemented by UK Boris Johnson, where he got rich through funding and supporting the renewable energy complex that profited from it significantly through the bribery, and through that suddenly it's all dropping down, and everyone's trying to protect themselves through oil, through energy, through artificial intelligence, through Bitcoin mining. And the Shell company, it won against a landslide. Basically, it was the climate change groups that were suing Shell. And I'm sorry for those climate change people. You have to rely upon Bitcoin, because Bitcoin allows you to take energy and invest in renewable energy and nuclear energy to reduce the carbon footprint by allowing those energy providers to use Bitcoin to repurpose the money so that they can reinvest. So you don't need to rely upon the proof of weapons network, printing money, creating inflation through inflationary acts, and you suffering to invest in the market, that when the market can create the renewable energy that is needed. And this is where the government, the Doge government efficiency, having people like RFK that get this, and people like Trump that may get this, and people like Elon Musk that may get this, creates a very interesting time in history. This is bullish for oil, but remember, everyone's got the reserves, so I don't expect much to happen with the price of oil. But the Paris Agreement is dying. So climate change people, unfortunately, don't fall for the psyop that BlackRock wanted you to think before it was pro-Bitcoin, and it was trying to take down Bitcoin, and it had an ESG narrative, and it was funding research to say Bitcoin's energy efficient, and it was trying to get you into Ethereum saying to reduce the carbon neutrality. Why did it do that? Because it wants to put Ethereum in the ETF. And Ethereum in an ETF means you can eventually stake it. And when you stake it, you get a voting right in the governance of the network. And then BlackRock could control it, just like it controls all the shares by getting you to buy your shares through BlackRock in the ETF. It's the same psyop. But it recognized that Bitcoin was a resistance. So immediately it got the Federal Reserve and the SEC to crash the market and get you to sell your Bitcoin and hand over your Bitcoin to BlackRock. And it is now getting millions of people from the pension funds to get into that. Recognize the trends time and time again. So anyway, the climate change agreement with the Trump administration, I expect Trump to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and focus on oil. And he said his policy is drill, baby, drill. And he wants to be the leader of artificial intelligence, the leader of Bitcoin mining, and the leader of energy. And it engaged in terrorism to make sure that Russia couldn't export to, the Biden administration did anyway, export to Germany, crash the German economy for the European Central Bank, and made sure that all of the exports of natural gas are coming from America, so it can suck up more of the money printing of the European Central Bank, get Germany deeper and deeper into debt. And they sold their Bitcoin, and then now they're going to have to print more euros, which will create and destabilize the whole region, so that people can sell their euros to buy dollar debt, to increase the price of dollars and suck up the entire economy into the Federal Reserve so it can plan its next transition into a central bank digital currency. Right. So what else will change? Let's transition slightly into the geopolitical section. I got a bit more macro section, and then we'll do the geopolitics and look at who is Trump hiring, so we can recognize, is he deep state or is he going to fight the deep state? We shall see. We will keep covering it. What I do forecast is that Trump, because he went for an Israel first policy and he took the majority of his funding from pro-Zionists, he will install many of those Zionists. And one of the most important things for the Zionists in Israel is to get regime change with Iran. And so the Biden administration actually didn't enforce many of the sanctions because the Trump tore up the nuclear deal. And so rather than going through embracements, it went through sanctions. The Biden administration didn't enforce those sanctions. I think the Trump administration will enforce those sanctions, which will escalate the situation in the Middle East, and that will pull Iran closer and closer to, rather than engaging in diplomacy with America and having a nuclear deal and opening up to inspection, and allowing Israel to have the illegal nukes that don't open up to inspection because it's the crazy one that's got a Samson directive that says if America no longer supports this, we'll nuke them. Iran would rather engage in a deal and work with America, but Israel says, no, you can't have a nuclear deal. Iran cannot work with America. We need to drive you to war, and we need to take that oil. And so because they funded Trump administration primarily, it will make sure it's getting its money worth. And so the first act is, I think, that Trump will aggressively enforce those sanctions, and that will drive Iran closer to Russia and China, because it will keep exporting its oil to China. China's got record reserves, and it bought all those reserves from Russia and China, which will drive more adoption to BRICS, which will drive more adoption to currency transactions happening within BRICS as a result of enforcing those sanctions, because Israel doesn't have an America first policy, it has an Israel first policy. And so the more Zionist the government is, the more AIPAC briberies happen. You'll get Iran being closer and closer to China and Iran, which will be at the detriment of America and the dollar, in order to get Israel and the Federal Reserve to have their policy. Remember, China will not yield to Trump's threats. It will have it will create a trade war. It will have its tariffs that will create inflation within America. But if it wants to get aggressive with sanctions on Iran, then China will not yield, because China needs Iran and Russia's oil for their strategic reserves. And so it will not have the impact that it needs in order to destroy the Iranian economy. I expect China will fight back and have closer ties and buy more oil from Iran as a result of any type of sanctions enforcement. And then if that destabilizes the region, or it destabilizes US because China wants to work with America, but the deep state wants it to go to war, then it can start releasing more and more of its oil reserves and make sure it doesn't blow up the US banking system in case the Federal Reserve tries to take down America as well. And so China has that tool as well. I don't think the supply of the reserves will change. China's trade surplus at the moment, despite the fact what American propaganda wants you to believe, they want you to believe China is screwed and it's all done. But its reserves are the largest they have ever been. It's now got reserves of $1 trillion. That is a new record, but they're no longer investing it in treasuries because of sanctions on Russia. So where's it going to invest that? Well, it can invest it in Bitcoin mining if it chooses. It can build a strategic reserve of China Bitcoin before it makes an announcement that is embracing Bitcoin again. It can also purchase gold, because the BRICS currency is going to be backed by a percentage of gold. And I predict it will be backed by a percentage of Bitcoin as well, as we get these strategic reserve assets going. At the same time, the US is completely trying to corner Europe right now. It has wrecked the economy. The ECB is destroying the economy, and America is benefiting by exporting as much natural gas to Europe. And it wants to export, and it wants to corner that whole market so it can prop up the proof of weapons network and have the Federal Reserve and the ECB control everything so that they can engage in the war, the currency war, with BRICS. I think it wants to use that so it can undercut basically some of the exports, the Eastern exports, and try and have more control over the price. Because remember, any hikes in the price, as we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine, it broke the US banking system, and the Federal Reserve implemented that inflation is transitory, hiked rates, took down Silicon Valley Bank, used Peter Thiel and Bill Ackman to get the bailouts, and then executed Operation Choke Point 2.0 in order to get the system in BlackRock's favor and the crypto takedown as well. As soon as RFK announced that he was going to be part of the Department of Health as one of Trump's selects, the pharmaceutical stocks tanked. Now, to be fair, the market was correcting at the same time, but the big pharma does not like RFK, and the deep state does like big pharma. And Mossad was responsible for the killing of RFK's family. And so if the deep state, he either has to suck up and not expose Israel and Mossad for their operations, or he has to play nicely with big pharma. This will be the deep state battle. Will RFK expose Mossad, or will he go in line and carry on his pro-Mossad strategy, pro-Israel strategy, because his family was assassinated by Mossad? So anyway, he's going to be the Secretary of Health. That is a win for the non-deep state, but only one weakness with him is because he knows his family was killed by Mossad, he has to always be pro-Israeli in his policy as well. Anyway, so that's one of the first ones as well. Now let's look at some of the others. Now I'm going to go to the geopolitical section. This will be the final section that we're going to go through. Hopefully we'll get this done within the next 15 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap all this up and we can see so that we've got all the trends that we need to follow week after week after week as we protect ourselves. Do me a favor, retweet, repost, share this with your loved ones. I want them to own as much Bitcoin in self-custody. I want them to understand why. I want them to join the journey, and hopefully you can do that for other people. Repost, share. YouTube's not going to share it. I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and then we're going to go into the final section on geopolitics and look at the hires. Okay, we are at the final part of the hurdle, the geopolitical section of Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 64. Now let's tie it all together. Right, so immediately after Trump's election, rumors came out that Trump had told Putin not to escalate the war in Ukraine in a phone call. That turned out to be fake news. As far as I can tell, there's been no call between Putin and Trump yet. And the WarHawks are going crazy. They are freaking out. That was fake news. They really, really want BlackRock to own all of Ukraine. Remember my previous videos where I followed the money and explained how this has got nothing to do with Ukrainian civilians. They're willing to, the deep state is willing to crucify and kill more Ukrainian civilians to push Trump, to push Putin further in a war they know they can't win, to scam the world into buying more and more weapons from NATO in order to take over and hand over half of Ukraine to BlackRock in its Israel first policy for the military-industrial complex. RFK exposed it. He said he's put videos out there. He knows what's happened. He can take that on as well. Trump came out and said this is great news for anti-deep state rhetoric, that Russia and China are not enemies, will engage in diplomacy. The United States will get on with China and Russia. That's the worst thing that the deep state can hear, and the military-industrial complex certainly doesn't like that. Elon Musk, he came out and said that he's met with Iran's UN ambassador. And the Iranian officials say that they had a meeting, and the meeting was about ways to de-escalate tensions between Iran and the United States. Israel won't like that because those relations, last time Trump, those relations were put by the Obama administration. Trump had to tear them up and make sure all diplomacy ends because Israel can't handle America and Iran having a relationship. So, if there is pushback and there is agreement to work with Iran, that is the peace agreement, and that requires a two-state solution. And that requires America to stop pretending that they're negotiating peace. And so that brings us to the final part I'll cover in that, which would be the UN Security Council that happened this week. I'll cover that at the end. Right. Turkey President Erdogan, he came out. He has said that he has savored all relations with Israel, but he didn't tell you that they're still allowing the oil to come underneath. That is the weapon if Israel wants to do it. And it may end up going full on BRICS, anti-NATO, But Israel, Turkey right now is saying the right things, but not necessarily doing them. But we'll take it. We'll keep an eye on Turkey. Very important one to watch. What did the guy, remember Boris Johnson, the deep state had to remove? Well, he ended up working for the NATO essentially as an agent, just like Tony Blair did when he was creating all these deep state negotiations. Boris Johnson, who was responsible for making sure that Ukraine and Russia never engaged in peace, told Zelensky, don't ever engage in peace, buy more weapons instead. And that led to the death of so many more Ukrainians as a result on this war that Ukraine can't win. And NATO will keep selling weapons. Well, he said on behalf of the UK, even though he no longer works for the UK, that the UK will send troops to Ukraine if Trump pulls US funding for Kiev. So the former Prime Minister of UK, and now we have Keir Starmer, who is a NATO first and Israel first injection Zionist. The former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is saying, we want to kill UK people and we will get UK troops to die for Ukraine if Trump pulls out funding deals for NATO. Well, guess what? Brits don't want to fight that war. Brits want peace, and you don't get to decide. You're not the UK Prime Minister anymore, but unfortunately, we need to know that there is a poodle of the military-industrial complex and a Zionist, which is Keir Starmer in the UK, which is why the UK, after the Bank of England destroyed it, handed everything over to the Federal Reserve as it's got America deep into debt. It left England with just a few economies. The UK is just a shell company for the Bank of England and the deep state, which only has a few industries left. It's got the military-industrial complex, it's got banking, and it's got big pharma. Guess who owns all those? And guess who was in charge of creating all the vaccines through AstraZeneca and profiting from everything while we got this whole COVID? Oh, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say those words anymore. I think we're at a time when we're allowed to say it now. Anyway, Johnson, you don't get to kill British people for Israel and the deep state agenda and the NATO and the military-industrial complex just so you can hand over Ukraine for BlackRock and get your backdoor payoff using your fake prime minister credibility in order to get paychecks just like Tony Blair. And now the Biden the Biden-Harris administration, they said immediately they're going to send every dollar they can persuade, and they can get to Ukraine before the Trump administration presidency begins. So they are doing everything they can not to get money to America, but to get money to Ukraine so that the military-industrial complex can profit and BlackRock can get more and more of Ukraine. So let's have a look at the ones that people are hiring, and then we'll go through the final part, the UN Security Council, and then we can wrap up Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 64. So remember what's important. You have a fake democracy, but those democracy is installing all the people, and AIPAC, who was funding all the political campaigns, the military-industrial complex that was funding the campaigns, the banking lobby that was funding the campaigns, the big pharma lobby that was funding the campaigns, they are now cashing in their check and putting in their WarHawks in order to keep the proof of weapons network and the Federal Reserve System going. So what is most important? It is, are those people bribed? Because they're the ones that are going to be bribed for Congress. And then who sits above the president? It's the CIA, which was taken over by Mossad, and it's the Federal Reserve that wants to keep the proof of weapons network going, driving all the funding for war and driving all the debt globally. They're the one that determines whether Trump goes or not by controlling the economy. And if they can't do it through financial means, then they can assassinate. And remember what Trump said? He said, if I get assassinated, blame Iran. Look at the FBI intelligence, but you're not going to fall for it because you know it was Mossad and Israel and the military-industrial complex. Okay. So who is blackmailed in this process? Well, let's see. Do we have a deep state? Do we have some of them more? Or do we have something slightly different? Well, if Trump wanted to give a demonstration that he is not installing the CIA and the deep state and an Israel first policy and a military-industrial complex policy, then what he could have done is, remember what I said, he's got to release all the files. Who agreed to release all the files from the CIA? Well, it was a gentleman called Kash Patel. And he agreed, if he is director of the CIA or if he is appointed, that he would immediately release the JFK files, which will go back to Mossad, the 9/11 files, which will go back to Mossad, the Jeffrey Epstein files, which will go back to Mossad, and the Book of Blackmail, which will go back to Mossad, the Russiagate files, which will prove it wasn't really Russia interfering, it was Mossad interfering, and the J6 pipe bomber controversy. And did he hire him? No. Who did he hire? He is now hired as in charge of the CISA, John Ratcliffe. So I did a bit of research on John Ratcliffe. He is the deep state. With no commitment to release those files only get released unredacted. You might get some token ones, but the truth only comes out if the deep state is not in charge of the CIA. The candidates that would have demonstrated that Trump is serious failed first test. You have got deep state through and through, pro-Zionists, ex-intelligence that will hide all of the truth from American people. So unfortunately, first test failed, and that's why he's allowed to be prime minister. If he exposes it, take out RFK, take out Trump, and J.D. Vance can take over and carry on. What did he do? What was his policies? Well, he was the guy that was pushing for more and more billions of dollars of military aid to go to Israel. He was pushing and pushing higher in defense. He was pushing more and more intelligence to go through to Israel. He was pushing that all of the artificial intelligence data should go back to Israel so that the Israel AI military industrial complex has the edge over Silicon Valley. And he was a conduit for Israel first policy. And basically, he, in his last Trump administration, was one of the people that had the hardline stance on Iran, saying, make sure you don't do a deal with Iran and make sure you allow Israel to have the nuclear nukes so that it can then escalate and use false flag operations, as the CIA always does, in order to escalate regime change with Iran as well. Okay, so we know we got a deep state head of CIA that is going to be pushing for war with Iran, and pushing for more and more sanctions, and you know the telltale signs in order to do that. So who should he have picked if he was serious about his policy? Well, he could have picked Tulsi Gabbard. He could have picked Colonel Douglas McGregor, which is all about exposing the deep state. They have a track record of exposing the deep state. He could have picked Rand Paul, who understands the end the Fed policy. He could have picked Thomas Massey, who released an end the Fed bill, and 2 days after, his wife was passed away with no explanation of what happened. We did get RFK Jr. in the health side. He could have implemented him in the Bitcoin policy, but yeah, we got the big pharma attack that we need to listen to. That's a tick sign. That's a good sign. But who else did he choose? Well, he chose, and these are the ones that have been decided, Marco Rubio, Elis, I'm so bad at these names, Elise Stefanik, Mike Waltz, Lee Zeldin, Mark Gates, sorry if I'm getting these names wrong, And so let's have a look at some of them, and then we're going to wrap up and look at the UN Security Council. So he appointed Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. He was the one that argued against evaluating the Epstein files and the sweetheart deals that happened. He was actively lobbying to free Ghislaine Maxwell, the Mossad agent that engaged in pedophilia ring in the Epstein ring, claiming that she was and Epstein were patriots of America. So there you go. Advocating for the deep state and the Epstein pedophilia rings to blackmail politicians. What about Marco Rubio? Well, Marco Rubio took $1 million in this election cycle from AIPAC in order to implement an Israel first policy. He's appointed as Secretary of State. He is a neocon warmongering that will certainly want war with Iran. And this signals escalation within the Middle East based upon previous track record and the fact that he was funded by $1 million of AIPAC money. We also had Brian Hook, who has been appointed as Senior Policy Advisor and Special Representative for... he was the Special Representative for Trump under the administration. So you can expect the same policy, no diplomacy, handing over an Israel first policy that led to the escalation, that led to October the 7th, that led to the environment that we're in right now, where Israel can decide how aggressive it wants and full American troops to die, just like Boris Johnson wants UK troops to die for Ukraine. He wants US troops to die for Israel. So it can be escalated into China reunification as the chips fall because of Iran needing to work with China, needing Iran strategically for this. He was the key figure in the implementation of the administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran. So you'd expect more of the same. What about Mike Waltz? Mark Waltz received $236,000 in order to implement an Israeli first policy from AIPAC. And basically, he was a part of the team that had a strong foreign policy and is a neocon, loves war, and wants to escalate. He's praying for, making more sure there's more military industrial complex spending in Japan, in Philippines, in Taiwan, and the other regions surrounding China. So he's a warhawk against China and a warhawk against Iran. What about Lee Zeldin? Lee Zeldin took $916,000 from an Israel first AIPAC policy. Another neocon warhawk will probably be there in order to ensure that Israel gets his war with Iran. We also had Marco Rubio. We already covered that one. Marco Rubio took $1 million from AIPAC. Marco Rubio is a very important position, and he is a neocon warhawk. We also got Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem is the one that signed a bill into law that made it where if you criticize Israel, and then that is anti-Semitic, and you have to have special rights to protect anti-Semitism, where you can criticize the US government, you can criticize the Chinese government, you can criticize anyone that is Islam or anything, but you cannot criticize Israel. Otherwise, it's anti-Semitic, and therefore it is going against the First Amendment, and this is anti-freedom of speech. And that is what she implemented based upon her Israel first policy. Also, Krifi Noem, Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem was putting together an Israel first policy that took away American people's right to boycott against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions bill, where everyday Americans, if they didn't want to fund any of the companies that were funding war, they could just boycott them. And she stood for implementing policies where Americans are no longer allowed to boycott Israel. You can boycott the military-industrial complex, you can boycott Big Pharma in America, but you can't boycott anyone that is against Israel. She stood for that. She got that through. And now the only country you cannot boycott in America and the only country you cannot criticize because it's anti-Semitic is now Israel, thanks to both of those. This is looking further and further towards the Federal Reserve policy of making sure that America moves to unconstitutional communist central bank digital currency. But remember the policies we covered. So you can no longer boycott one country. You can boycott anyone else, thanks to this appointee of Trump. He also appointed Elise Stefanik. Elise Stefanik took $917,000 from Israel First AIPAC and has always backed the legalization and aimed to provide as much military aid to Israel and get as much money over to Israel over American people. And so those are all the people that the Trump administration, because he was funded by Israel, basically had to take Madelson's candidates and give them jobs in order to play president of the United States. Keep an eye out for all of them. We'll keep following the money on Bitcoin Hard Talk. And we got one more piece to remember. Now, remember how America right now under the Biden administration is pretending that they're negotiating peace and they want a Palestinian two-state solution and they want Palestine to be self-determination based upon the lies of the Zionist Antony Blinken, and Antony Blinken, whose family is connected to Mossad and Ghislaine Maxwell and the Epstein ring, and is also a Zionist where his family were the original founders that said you need to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians, saying that he came primarily to negotiate as Israel first, a Jewish person first, not for America first. Well, yesterday, the United Nations took another vote. And the vote was basically, the results were 170 countries voted that they want for what I'm about to read out. Only 6 countries voted against it, and only one Security Council veto voted it, so that the 170 countries could not get what they voted for against the 6 countries. And the one country that veto voted against it was America. So what were they veto voting against? Well, let me read out the resolution that America veto voted against 170 countries. This was to state that the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and a two-state solution. Israel says the Palestinians will never have self-determination, will never have a two-state solution. Their parliament has already agreed on it. And the Zionists and the Likud directive said that the mission is to slowly take over the region and use violence and deceit in order to achieve it. And America is pretending that it is trying to negotiate peace right now. Why? Because America is Zionist controlled. When you follow the money through the media, through the banking system, through the deep state, through intelligence agencies, through Congress. And that is what draining the swamp really means. And unfortunately, the one person that could have been appointed the head of the CIA to release these files that would expose the whole damn thing wasn't selected by Trump. And so the 6 nations that voted against peace and Palestinian self-determination, which is the requirement not to move to World War III when you play all the chips and understand all the moves on the chessboard, was the United States, Israel, Argentina, who just handed over all of the gold to the Rothschild & Co. Bank in London so that Argentina cannot protect itself. And hopefully Argentina fights back with a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset. but it looks like it repelled. It decided not to join BRICS and instead to go full on the dollar. Is an agent of the Federal Reserve. Paraguay and Micronesia. Nauru, and those are the 6 countries, and the US voted it. US is not voting for peace. US does not want peace because US is controlled by the deep state, and it all goes back to following the money, a world of Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies, and artificial intelligence. The US veto voted against peace, as it has done every year for decades, which is why we are where we are. Global consensus is exactly what the entire world has said, other than those that are bribed and those that are controlled. So no peace. According to the Biden administration, will that change with Trump? Well, they hired in the United Nations an Israel First Zionist. So expect more of the same, which is a vote for World War III, which is a vote for an Israel First policy, which is a vote for the Federal Reserve taking on Trump. And we need to understand, how does everyone protect themselves? This is the same thing that we have seen time and time again. In the meantime, I'm going to wrap up right here. The genocide is still continuing. Violence is outbreaking in Amsterdam. Violence is outbreaking in Israel. IDF and Mossad are following football hooligans, not showing what happens before it, and creating more and more civil unrest around the regions, just like happened in the UK through the Mossad paid agent Tommy Robinson. This is happening now in UK, Amsterdam, France, and it's coming to a country near you, based upon weaponizing immigration policy, open borders, and control of the media to get us to civil unrest. If Trump dares, or RFK dares, or any of those people dare to take back control of Constitution of America to the Constitution and stand up against the Fed and stand up against the CIA. So that's all the good news. That's all the bad news. We will only tell you the truth. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Our leaders are taking us to very bad times for some, really good time for others that are protecting themselves with Bitcoin. I want to make sure that you're on the right side of the change. Please do share, please do like, please do spread this to as many people as you love and care about, so that maybe they can understand what they need to do to protect themselves, and they can do that for their companies, and they can do that for their countries, and they can do that for their states. And eventually we can build, if we are going to get a central bank digital currency, we can restructure the economy, do it under the treasury, do what many, many people were assassinated with, which is implement debt-free money into infrastructure-backed loans based upon hard money. And we can return control back to the states, and we can decentralize further and further and further. And we can do the whole thing on proof of work while they try to control proof of stake. And we can figure out how to transition in it with peace, love, and unity, evolutionary, rather than the Fed and the deep state's policy of World War III and violence, death, and destruction. Fight back with Bitcoin on all scales. And I'm going to see you this time next week for Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 65. Peace.